Pick up a shovel right now. Walk outside to a patch of ground anywhere in Kansas or Nebraska. Dig straight down. At 1 foot, the dirt is cold, maybe 35 degrees Fahrenheit in January. At 2 feet, it warms a little. At 3 feet, warmer still. At 4 feet, you hit something strange. The ground isn't frozen. It isn't cold. It's sitting at roughly 52 degrees Fahrenheit, the same temperature it was in July, the same temperature it will be next July. No heater, no insulation, no fuel. Just the earth doing what it has always done, which is hold the memory of every season it has ever seen and release that stored warmth so slowly that a single winter can't touch it. A 5-year-old girl understood this in the fall of 1880. She didn't learn it from a textbook. She didn't have one. She learned it the way most real survival knowledge gets learned, from watching the ground, from noticing where the rabbits went when the temperature dropped, from paying attention to things that most people in 1880 were too busy surviving above ground to notice below it. Her name was Frieda Halvorsen. She was 15 years old, Norwegian by descent, born in Fillmore County, Minnesota in 1865. She arrived in Custer County, Nebraska, on foot in October of 1880 with $4.13 in her coat pocket, a blanket that had been her mother's, and a cast-iron frying pan she'd taken from the wagon before anyone could stop her. She had no parents. She had no claim to any land. She had no one waiting for her at the other end of any road. What she did have, and what the man who would later try to take her claim land never accounted for, was the understanding that the earth itself was a stove. A massive, ancient, reliable stove that never ran out of fuel, never cracked from the cold, and never needed a cord of wood to keep burning. By the spring of 1881, after the most catastrophic winter the Central Plains had seen in living memory, Frieda Halvorsen walked out of the hillside she had burrowed into 5 months earlier, leading 2 goats and a neighbor's cow that she had sheltered when the neighbor's barn collapsed under 3 feet of ice-crusted snow. The valley around her, the one everyone else had settled in, was empty. 17 families had abandoned their claims. 4 people had died. The livestock losses in Custer County alone ran into the thousands of head. Frieda had lost nothing. She filed a homestead preemption intent with a witness in April 1881 and proved up in 1886. This is how she did it, and this is the science that made it possible. Her parents had come west from Fillmore County in the summer of 1879, part of the wave of Norwegian immigrants that flooded Dakota Territory and northern Nebraska after the Burlington and Missouri River Railroad began advertising land at $3 to $6 an acre, prices that looked like a miracle, to families farming rented ground in Minnesota. Her father, Lars Halvorsen, was 44 years old and had never owned an acre of anything. Her mother, Ingeborg, was 41. Frieda was 14 when they loaded everything they owned onto a borrowed wagon and headed southwest. Lars died of typhoid fever at the Niobrara River crossing on the 11th of August, 1879. The crossing was shallow that year, barely knee-deep, but the river water was contaminated. Several other men on the same wagon train sickened and survived. Lars did not. He was buried in unmarked ground on the south bank. Ingeborg, already weakened by the journey, developed what the wagon captain recorded in his log as lung fever. She held on through August and into September. She died on the 14th of September, 1879, on the plains of Cherry County, Nebraska, 16 miles from any settlement. Frieda was 14 years old. She had a younger brother named Tor, who was 11. She had the blanket, the frying pan, and $4.13 that her mother had kept sewn into the hem of her traveling coat. The wagon captain, a man from Ohio named Cornelius Blakely, made a decision that was practical and not unusual for the period. He distributed the Halvorsen family's 2 oxen and their spare provisions to other families in the train. The wagon itself went to a family whose wheel had cracked beyond repair. Frieda and Tor were given what remained: the blanket, the frying pan, the money, their parents' clothing, and a direction. Blakely told Frieda the nearest settlement with a general store was southwest, roughly 40 miles. He didn't send them off cruelly. He wasn't a cruel man. He was a man managing a wagon train with 6 other families, heading into fall on the Nebraska plains, and 2 orphaned Norwegian children were a liability he could not afford. He gave them a day's worth of salt pork and hardtack, and told Frieda to follow the creek south and then west. Tor died on the 3rd day. He had been coughing since the Niobrara. It wasn't typhoid, it was pneumonia, the same thing that had probably killed his mother. He was 11 years old. Frieda buried him as well as she could in loose creek soil, marked the grave with 2 cottonwood sticks, and kept walking southwest. She reached the settlement of Mason Creek, in the eastern reaches of what would become Custer County, Nebraska, in late September of 1879. She was 14, alone, and she had $4.13. She spent the winter of 1879-80 working in the household of a farmer named Einar Backe, a Dane who had arrived the previous year and filed a homestead claim on 160 acres of decent bottom ground near the creek. She cooked, cleaned, mended harness, tended Backe's 4 pigs and 7 chickens, and slept in a lean-to shed attached to the south wall of the sod house. In exchange, she received meals and a place to sleep, with no wages. In the spring of 1880, Backe remarried a widow from Broken Bow named Clara Hennessy, who arrived in April with 2 daughters of her own, 12 and 9 years old. Clara made it clear, without particular hostility, that there was no longer room for Frieda. Backe gave her $1.50 for the winter's work, which she did not refuse. He also gave her, somewhat sheepishly, a worn spade with a cracked handle that he had replaced with a new one. Frieda Halvorsen was 15 years old, possessed of $5.63 total in the world: a blanket, a frying pan, a spade with a cracked handle, and 10 months of hard-earned knowledge of how to live on the Nebraska plains. She spent the summer of 1880 watching the land. She did not wander far. She worked odd days for 2 other settlers in exchange for food, and she studied the geography of Custer County the way a prospector studies rock formations, not for beauty, but for utility. What she was looking for was a specific kind of hillside. The valley the settlers had clustered in was obvious, in the way that settlers chose land in 1880. Flat, near water, good grass. The Mason Creek bottom stretched roughly 1.5 miles wide, with gentle slopes rising on both sides. Most of the claim shanties and sod houses were built in the bottom, near the water. The slopes were considered marginal, too uneven for easy ploughing, too far from the creek in dry months. On the north-facing side of the valley's eastern end, where the slope met a low bluff of pale clay and sandstone, there was a section of hillside that nobody had claimed. The reason was obvious. The bluff faced north, meaning it got almost no direct sunlight. The soil was clay-heavy and rocky. Below the bluff, the ground was damp most of the year. Springs fed from somewhere above the sandstone layer kept the base of the slope wet. The grass was different there, coarser, darker, growing in thick mats over ground that never fully dried out even in August. Frieda went there in late August of 1880 and drove her spade into the base of the slope, 4 feet from the hillside. The surface foot was dry and hard. The second foot was damper. At 3 feet, the spade hit ground that was noticeably warmer than the air. It was one of those August evenings when the temperature had dropped sharply at sunset, and the ground at depth was warmer than the surface. She drove the spade in again, a foot to the side, and got the same result. She went back in early October, 2 days after the first hard frost of that fall. Air temperature at dawn was well below freezing, and the ground at the surface was frozen solid. She drove the spade down along the base of the bluff, now using the cracked handle carefully so it wouldn't snap. At 18 inches, the ground was no longer frozen. At 2.5 feet, it was damp and loose. At 3 feet, she hit the same warmth she'd found in August, not warm the way a room is warm, but warm the way a hand is warm, the warmth of something that holds heat because it has mass enough to do it. The north-facing slope was not a liability. It was the advantage she had been looking for. Here is the physics of what Frieda had found, which she understood by observation rather than formula. The earth below the frost line in Custer County, Nebraska, runs approximately 36 to 42 inches deep, maintains a temperature very close to the mean annual air temperature for that location. In eastern Custer County in 1880, that was somewhere between 48 and 54 degrees Fahrenheit. It holds that temperature because the earth at depth has enormous thermal mass. Thermal mass is the ability of a material to absorb heat and release it slowly. The denser and heavier the material, the more heat it can store and the longer it takes to release. A cubic foot of dry soil weighs roughly 80 to 100 pounds. A single wall of packed sod 2 feet thick and 10 feet long and 7 feet tall contains somewhere in the range of 10,000 pounds of material. That material absorbed heat all summer, not hot heat, just the steady warmth of the Nebraska sun, the warmth of ground at depth, and it releases that stored heat so slowly that a winter storm, or even 7 months of winter, cannot strip it out completely. The earth doesn't warm a space the way a stove does. It maintains a floor, a lower limit below which the temperature inside the earth simply will not fall, regardless of what is happening above. The north-facing slope was an advantage, for a reason that took Frieda a moment to work out, but that became obvious once she saw it. The south-facing slopes received more direct sunlight in summer and lost more heat through radiation in winter, their surfaces swinging between temperature extremes. The north-facing slope was shaded most of the year. Its surface stayed cooler in summer, meaning it shed less of its deep-stored heat through the surface layer. The temperature differential between the ground surface and the ground at depth was smaller on the north slope, which meant the earth at depth held its warmth more uniformly through the winter. She was going to dig into the hill. The north side of the bluff also did one more thing she had noted. It sat at the east end of the valley, where the slope curved slightly inward, creating a shallow natural bowl sheltered from the northwest. Every hard wind she'd seen since arriving in Custer County came from the northwest. The bluff and the curve of the valley's east wall would take most of that wind above and around any structure at the base of the slope. What she was looking at when she stood at the base of that clay and sandstone bluff in October 1880 with $5.63 and a cracked spade was the most defensible position in the valley. She started digging on the 8th of October, 1880. She knew from the cold air at dawn and the way the geese were moving south that the hard winter was coming early. She had seen the spring floods of 1880, the hot, dry summer, the early first frost. The old Dane Backey's oldest neighbour, a man named Jedediah Marsh, who had trapped the Upper Platte in the 1850s, had told anyone who would listen that summer that the animals were running wrong. The badgers were digging deeper than usual. The mice had abandoned the grain cribs and moved into the walls of the sod house. The geese had come through 2 weeks early, and in numbers he hadn't seen since the bad winter of 1856. Frieda had listened. The settlers in the valley bottom had not. The design she chose was called a half dugout, which sounds simpler than it was. A true dugout is excavated entirely below grade. You dig a pit, cover it with a roof, and the walls are the sides of the pit itself. A half dugout cuts into a slope. You excavate horizontally into the hillside, creating a space that is partly below grade and partly earth-walled on 3 sides, with a front face that is exposed. Frieda excavated 14 feet into the bluff horizontally and 12 feet wide. The floor was set at 4.5 feet below the outside grade, at the deepest point the back of the dugout. This put the floor below the frost line. The ceiling was the underside of the bluff itself, which she cut level at 7 feet and then reinforced with 5 cottonwood poles she had harvested from the creek bottom 2 miles south, each one roughly 6 inches in diameter, notched at the ends and set into the clay walls. She lashed smaller willow branches across these poles to create a lattice, then piled sod on top of the lattice, grass side up, 2 layers thick, each brick roughly 12 inches wide and 4 inches thick, weighing approximately 50 pounds each. Counting the sod on the roof and the sod she stacked as a front wall, the only exposed face of the structure she moved somewhere in the range of 400 sod bricks. At 50 pounds each, that was 20,000 pounds of earth she cut, carried, and laid. She did it over 11 days, working from first light until she lost the light, eating salt pork and hardtack, and 2 rabbits she snared in the creek bottom. She used $1.20 of her money for one thing: a door frame, 2 pieces of rough-sawn pine lumber she bought from a man named Gus Helmer, who ran a small lumber operation 7 miles east. She fitted the frame into the front face of the dugout and hung a door she built herself from the flattest willow branches she could find. Lashed together with strips of rawhide cut from a deer hide she had traded 2 days' labor to obtain. It wasn't a good door, but it was tight enough to keep out direct wind. The front wall, the only part of the structure exposed to weather, was 3 courses of sod thick, 2.5 feet of packed earth, grass roots woven together into a mat that no wind could penetrate. She left one window, a single square, roughly 14 inches on a side, covered with a piece of oiled canvas. When the light was sufficient to work without a candle, she left it open. When it was not, she tied it shut with a leather lace. Inside the dugout, at the back wall where the ground was deepest, she dug a small pit in the floor 18 inches deep, 2 feet square, lined with flat stones from the creek bed. This was her heat store. She understood the way people who live close to the ground understand things. That the stone floor of a pit dug below grade would hold heat longer than bare earth because the stone had greater thermal mass than packed dirt. It was denser, heavier, and slower to release warmth once heated. She built a small fire in this pit each evening, let it burn down to coals, and covered it with a flat stone that she had fitted carefully to sit across the top of the pit. The stone heated slowly. It released heat slowly. Through the night, as the fire went cold, the stone breathed warmth into the dugout's air, not dramatically, not in a way that would impress anyone who had a proper cast-iron stove, but steadily, the way the earth itself breathes, without urgency and without stopping. This is what thermal mass does. It does not generate heat, it stores it. The difference between a thin-walled frame shanty with a cast-iron stove and a sod dugout with a stone heat store is not the peak temperature the cast-iron stove gets hotter faster. The difference is what happens at 3 in the morning when the fire has gone out and the temperature outside drops to -30 degrees Fahrenheit. In the frame shanty, every BTU the stove put into the room has leaked through the thin walls and is gone. The room temperature follows the outside temperature downward. In the dugout, the heat stored in the walls, in the floor, in the stone pit, in the 20,000 pounds of earth pressed against 3 sides of the structure that heat is still there. Not all of it, but enough to hold the interior above freezing while the valley outside drops to temperatures that split green cottonwood trees along their grain. To be specific about the numbers, a cubic foot of packed soil has a volumetric heat capacity of approximately 30 BTUs per cubic foot per degree Fahrenheit. The back wall of Frieda's dugout, 12 feet wide, 7 feet tall, 2.5 feet thick, contained roughly 210 cubic feet of packed earth. That wall alone stored approximately 6,300 BTUs for every degree Fahrenheit of its temperature. If the back wall averaged 50 degrees Fahrenheit going into winter, which the ground at that depth would, and the interior needed to stay above 32 degrees Fahrenheit, The wall had roughly 113,400 BTUs of reserve warmth to give up before conditions became critical. A small fire burning half a pound of wood per hour generates roughly 4,000 BTUs per hour. Frieda's stone pit, burning for 2 hours each evening on a handful of dried buffalo chips and cottonwood scraps, added perhaps 8,000 BTUs daily to the structure's thermal reserve, which was enough, combined with the wall's stored heat, to keep the interior above freezing even on nights when she did not light a fire at all. She had 2 other sources of warmth that she built deliberately into the dugout's design, and both were animals. She had acquired 2 goats over the summer, a nanny and a yearling wether, by performing 2 weeks of labour for a widow named Hannah Sandvik, who lived 4 miles north. The goats were technically a loan against future work, but Hannah had told her she could keep them through the winter if she needed. Frieda needed them. She built a low partition at the front of the dugout, directly inside the door, that separated the goats from the sleeping area by 6 feet. The partition was sod 1 course thick, 3 feet high, with a willow gate she could open. The goats slept on the straw she had cut from the creek bottom and dried on the sunny side of the bluff through September. They generated continuous warmth. A healthy nanny goat produces roughly 250 to 300 BTUs per hour, simply by existing. 2 goats, through an 8-hour night, added 4,000 to 4,800 BTUs to the air of the enclosed space, which was everything. His name was Douglas Farwell. He was 38 years old, from Ohio, and he had filed a homestead claim in August of 1879 on 160 acres of the valley's best bottom ground, a quarter section with creek frontage, good soil, and flat enough to plough without difficulty. He had built a proper 2-room frame house by the fall of 1879, freighted in from Broken Bow at a cost he told anyone who would listen was $340. He had a stove, a proper cast-iron farmer's friend model, heavy enough that it had taken 3 men to lift it off the freight wagon. He had 23 head of cattle and a team of draft horses. He had a proper barn, sod-walled but frame-roofed, capable of holding all his livestock. Farwell had watched Frieda Halvorsen all summer, not because he was interested in her welfare, but because he was interested in her ground. The north-facing bluff at the east end of the valley was technically unclaimed land, and Farwell had been eyeing it for 2 years as a possible location for a second, larger barn. The bluff itself was useless for crops, but the flat ground at its base, the wet, spring-fed ground Frieda had put her dugout into, would be good, he thought, for a hay meadow once properly drained. He visited the dugout site in mid-October, 2 days after Frieda had finished the front wall. He stood at the top of the low bluff and looked down at what she had built and said nothing for a long moment. "That's a badger hole," he said finally. Frieda was sealing the joint between the front wall and the hillside with a mixture of clay and dry grass. She did not look up. Farwell said a girl living in a dirt hole in the side of a hill was going to freeze solid before Christmas, and that he would be willing to pay her $3 for the spade when that happened, since it was a better quality tool than it looked. He said the wet ground at the base of the bluff was going to wick moisture straight up through the floor, and she'd be sleeping in mud inside a week. He said that anyone who had spent more than 1 winter on the Nebraska plains knew that the temperature swings that killed cattle in their barns were not going to spare a child hiding in the side of a hill under a pile of dirt. He predicted, with a precision that reflected genuine confidence, that she would be dead or gone by February. Frieda packed another handful of clay into the joint and said nothing. What Farwell understood, and he wasn't wrong about this, was that standard sod construction had real weaknesses. He had seen sod roofs collapse under wet snow. He had seen sod walls wick moisture and crumble in freeze-thaw cycles. He had seen settlers abandon dugouts after a single season because the interior was dark, damp, and smelled of rot. He had seen them flood. He had seen the goats that settlers kept in their dugouts sick and miserable by February from the bad air. What he didn't understand was that Frieda's dugout was not standard. The floor was below the frost line, which meant it was warmer and drier than the soil above it. The back wall was set into the clay layer of the bluff, which was nearly impermeable to water. The moisture that moved through the bluff ran along the clay interface and came out at the base of the slope in the springs, not through the clay itself. The north-facing aspect she had chosen meant the front wall received almost no direct solar radiation, which sounds like a disadvantage, but in winter actually reduced the freeze-thaw cycling that destroyed south-facing. Sod walls. The front face froze in October and stayed frozen through March, solid as brick. Farwell visited twice more before November. He brought other settlers with him the second time, Ned Pryor, who farmed 80 acres of the valley floor, and the Swanson brothers, Carl and Anders, who had arrived from Minnesota in the spring and were struggling to get their claim shanty tight enough for winter. They stood at the base of the bluff and looked at Frieda's completed dugout, the low sod front wall, the willow door, the small canvas-covered window, and Ned Pryor said it looked like a place you'd bury a dog. Carl Swanson, who was 23 and had never wintered on the plains, asked whether she had a stove. She told him she had a stone pit. He asked what a stone pit was. She showed him the flat sandstone cap over the fire pit inside. He looked at it for a moment and said he didn't see how a warm rock was going to keep her alive in a Dakota January. "This is Nebraska," Frieda said. Carl laughed and told Anders the Norwegian girl was going to freeze in her Nebraska badger hole, and they walked back down the valley. Farwell told Ned Pryor, as they walked away, that the spring ground at the base of the bluff would make a fine hay meadow, and he'd file the preemption paperwork in the spring when the girl was gone. Ned didn't argue with him. There was no particular reason to believe Frieda would survive, and Farwell had been on the plains 3 years longer than anyone else in the valley. He knew winters they didn't. Frieda spent the last 2 weeks of October on 3 tasks. She cut and dried 400 pounds of creek-bottom grass and stacked it inside the dugout against the south interior wall as fodder for the goats. She hauled flat creek stones and stacked them just inside the doorway, creating a thermal buffer zone between the door and the interior. Cold air coming through the door would hit the stone mass first and lose some of its chill before reaching the living space. And she negotiated with Hannah Sandvik, the widow 4 miles north, for the use of a third animal through the winter. The animal was a milk cow named Britta, an 8-year-old shorthorn that Hannah could not get through the winter in her own inadequate shelter. Hannah was going to stay with her daughter in Broken Bow from December through March and had nowhere to put the cow. Frieda offered to winter the animal in exchange for milk rights through the cold months, and Hannah's agreement to testify at a future land filing that Frieda had occupied the site since October 1880. Hannah said yes immediately, and the cow was delivered on November 3. A healthy milk cow in full winter coat generates between 1,000 and 1,500 BTUs per hour. Through an 8-hour night, Britta added somewhere between 8,000 and 12,000 BTUs to the air of the dugout, more than Frieda's stone pit fire. The combined output of 2 goats and a cow, held in a 1-4 by 1-2 foot earth-walled space with 3 feet of sod on 3 sides and a hillside at its back, transformed the dugout from a marginally survivable shelter into something genuinely warm, not comfortable by any standard. A person in a frame house with a cast-iron stove would recognize as warm, but warm by the standard of what matters, which is the difference between living and not living. The smell, Frieda noted in the brief account she gave to the Custer County Land Office in 1886, was considerable. She did not complain about it. On the 15th of October, 1880, a blizzard struck southeastern Dakota Territory and northeastern Nebraska with almost no warning. Settlers in Custer County saw the sky turn a peculiar greenish-grey to the northwest in the early afternoon, and had perhaps 3 hours before the temperature dropped 20 degrees and the wind hit from the northwest at what witnesses estimated as 50 miles per hour. Snow came in horizontal sheets. This was the opening storm of what would become known as the hard winter of 7 months of near-continuous blizzards, cold snaps, and ice storms that did not relent until early May. A 2020 study published in the Bulletin of the American Meteorological Society, analyzing the meteorological records of the period, confirmed that the winter of 1880-81 was the coldest on record at Omaha, Nebraska, and Des Moines, Iowa. November 1880 remains the coldest November ever recorded at Omaha. Each month from October 1880 through April 1881 ran 5 to 10 degrees Fahrenheit below monthly averages. Snowdrifts reached 6 to 8 feet across eastern Nebraska and up to 40 feet deep in the railroad cuts of the Dakota Territory, cutting off rail service for months at a stretch. Settlers across the Central Plains burned their furniture for heat. They burned hay, twisted into tight cylinders to slow the combustion. They ground seed wheat, the wheat they needed for spring planting in coffee mills, because the flour supply had run out, and there was no way to resupply over roads buried under 6 feet of drifted snow. The death toll was never compiled precisely. People died alone, in remote claim shanties, and their deaths didn't make it into any record until spring. In the Mason Creek Valley of Custer County, the hard winter arrived and did what cold does to structures that are not built for it. Douglas Farwell's $340 frame house held through November. Though his fuel consumption was alarming, he had laid in what he thought was a generous supply of hardwood, roughly 2 cords, and he burned through half of it in 6 weeks. His cattle barn was unheated. He ran the stove at maximum intensity and still watched the interior temperature of his house drop to 30 degrees Fahrenheit on the coldest nights. The water barrel freezing solid by morning despite being 2 feet from the stove. He added a second layer of burlap over the window frames and chinked the wall gaps with clay and rags, which helped somewhat. By mid-December, the temperature had dropped to an officially recorded 22 degrees Fahrenheit at the Broken Bow Weather Station, 25 miles east. The Swanson brothers' claim shanty rough-sawn boards with a single layer of tar paper was uninhabitable. Carl and Anders Swanson moved into the Pryor family's sod house on December 19, which put 7 people in a 1.6 by 1.4 foot space. Ned Pryor's sod house was better than a frame shanty, but its walls were only 18 inches thick, standard construction and improperly laid, with no bond courses, so the interior wall face had begun to crumble. Temperature inside the Pryor house on the coldest nights ran approximately 38 degrees Fahrenheit, which is above freezing and survivable but profoundly miserable for a family that included a 2-year-old child. January arrived and did not improve. The blizzard that struck on January 3rd, 1881, lasted 4 days and deposited snow that drifted against the south walls of the valley's structures to roof height. Farwell lost 3 cattle in that storm. They broke through a weakened section of barn wall and were found frozen 200 yards from the barn door. His wood supply was now critical. He began burning fence rails, and by the end of January he was burning his chicken coop, board by board. Inside the dugout, at the base of the North Bluff, Frieda Halvorsen tracked the temperature twice daily by the behavior of a shallow dish of water she kept near the door. When the surface of the water crystallized formed ice crystals but didn't freeze solid, she estimated the temperature near the door at 34 to 36 degrees Fahrenheit. When it froze solid, the temperature was below 32 degrees Fahrenheit. In the entire winter of 1880-81, the water dish froze solid on 9 nights. She knew this because she kept a count, scratching marks into the clay of the north wall. Those 9 nights below freezing occurred at the door, the coldest part of the space, directly exposed to the gap under the door and the seepage of cold air through the willow frame. The back of the dugout, near the stone pit, never froze. She never once woke to find her water bucket solid. The physics of what that contrast represents are worth examining in detail because the mechanism is specific. Farwell's frame house had walls made of rough-sawn pine boards. Pine wood provides roughly R1, 25 per inch of insulation. So a 5-inch board provides about R19. His double-wall construction, if he had it, which most homesteaders did not, might have reached R4 with air gap. When the outside temperature dropped to -22 degrees Fahrenheit and he needed the inside to stay at 40 degrees Fahrenheit, the temperature differential across his wall was 62 degrees. At R4, the heat loss through each square foot of wall was 15.5 BTUs per hour. His house had perhaps 400 square feet of exterior wall surface, putting total heat loss at 6,200 BTUs per hour. His farmer's friend cast-iron stove, burning dry hardwood at maximum, output roughly 40,000 BTUs per hour, but only when actively burning, which required constant feeding and monitoring through the night. Frieda's dugout walls, the front face, and the top of the sod roof presented roughly 120 square feet of exposed surface to outside temperatures. The other 3 sides and the floor were embedded in earth at 50 degrees Fahrenheit. At -22 degrees Fahrenheit outside and 40 degrees Fahrenheit inside, the temperature differential across her exposed front wall was 62 degrees. But her sod wall was 30 inches thick. At roughly R0.25 per inch for packed earth, that gave her approximately R7, 5 on the front face. Heat loss through the front worked out to 9.9 BTUs per hour per square foot, times 120 square feet, equaling 1,190 BTUs per hour total. Her 2 goats and milk cow, simply by being alive, generated 1,500 to 2,100 BTUs per hour. The animals alone more than covered the heat loss on the worst nights, with the stone pit fire as backup. The earth-sheltered 3 walls contributed something harder to calculate, but equally real. They did not lose heat to the outside at all. They gained it from the ground behind them. The ground at 4.5 feet depth was maintaining 50-52 degrees Fahrenheit. The interior was 40-45 degrees Fahrenheit. The temperature differential between the earth behind the walls and the interior was 5 to 12 degrees, not a loss situation, but a gain situation, meaning the walls were slowly and continuously adding heat to the space rather than removing it. Farwell's house was fighting the cold. Frieda's dugout was using the earth. On February 2nd, 1881, the same day that a blizzard hit Mason Creek Valley with 40 mph, winds from the northwest and temperatures that dropped to an estimated -28 degrees Fahrenheit, the roof of Douglas Farwell's barn collapsed. It didn't happen all at once. The snow load on the frame roof had been building for 6 weeks. When the February 2nd storm added 8 inches of new snow on top of ice-crusted old drifts, the ridge beam, a 6-inch diameter ash log, good timber but not properly seasoned when cut, snapped. The north half of the roof came down at roughly 11 inches the morning. Farwell was inside his house at the time. By the time he reached the barn, 7 of his remaining 20 cattle were dead, 3 crushed by the timber, 4 more that had bolted through the broken wall into the open and were found frozen by evening. His draft horses had survived in the south stalls, which were partially protected by the remaining roof section. He came to Frieda's dugout that afternoon, crossing a 1/4 mile of valley floor and breaking through drifts to his waist in places. He arrived at the dugout's front wall at roughly 3 inches the afternoon, frost-bitten on his right cheek and the fingers of his left hand where his glove had torn. He knocked on the willow door, and Frieda opened it. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the interior. The stone pit was glowing with fresh coals. The 2 goats were standing in the front partition, warm and unhurt, looking at him with mild interest. The cow Britta was in the back half of the space, lying down. The air temperature inside was warm enough that his breath stopped clouding immediately after he crossed the threshold. Farwell asked if he could bring his remaining cattle and horses into the dugout. There was no dramatic exchange. There was no moment where Frieda made him apologize or acknowledge what he had said in October. She assessed the situation practically 13 cattle and 2 horses on top of her 2 goats and 1 cow was too many animals for a 1-4 by 1-2 foot space, physically and in terms of air quality. She told him she could take the horses and 4 of the cattle. The remaining cattle would have to be crowded into the roofless section of his barn, with windbreaks improvised from the fallen timber. He went back through the storm and returned with the horses and 4 cattle within 2 hours. They managed to get the animals into the dugout's outer partition and the front section of the space by moving the goats to the back. It was crowded, and it smelled worse than anything Farwell had experienced in 38 years of living, including a summer he'd spent working a rendering yard in Chillicothe, Ohio. He told Frieda this. "It's warm," she said. The animals they could not shelter 9 of Farwell's cattle spent the night in the open section of the collapsed barn with canvas draped over the broken wall gap. 5 of them were dead by morning. 4 survived, and they were the 4 that had been in the dugout. Farwell slept in the dugout that night, and the night after, and the night after that. He slept on the floor near the stone pit. On the 4th morning, he woke at dawn and looked at the dish of water near the door, and it had not frozen. He lay there in the straw, with the smell of 5 large animals and a 15-year-old Norwegian girl's cooking fire in his nose, and he was warm. And he understood something he had been too certain to consider in October. He had thought the cold was the enemy. He had spent $340 on a house designed to fight the cold, to generate enough heat to hold the cold back, to burn enough wood to outproduce what the walls leaked. He had been fighting the plains the way you fight something that can be overpowered. The earth at the back of this hill was not fighting anything. It was simply there, holding its 50 degrees, indifferent to the worst winter in Nebraska's memory. The girl had not fought the cold, she had gotten below it. Over the following 10 days, the other settlers in the valley began coming to the dugout in pairs. Not for shelter, most of them had structures intact enough to survive in, barely, but for warmth when their fuel ran out, for a place to bring animals when their barns became untenable, and in one case, for a place to thaw a man's frost-bitten feet, which Frieda did with careful competence, using water she kept just above freezing near the door. The Pryor family burned their last fence post on February 8th. Ned Pryor brought his wife and children to the dugout on February 9th. It was a walk of 600 yards across the valley floor through knee-deep snow, and they stayed 4 days. The 2-year-old child, who had been coughing since December, stopped coughing in the 2nd day of the dugout's warmth. Ned Pryor told his wife he believed the child would have died in another week in the sod house. The Swanson brothers sent word through Pryor on February 11th asking if there was room. There wasn't not for people. Not in the space already occupied by 3 families and a collection of livestock that had grown to include a dog, a sheep, and Farwell's 2 horses. Frieda told Pryor to tell the Swansons to come during the day, warm up, and go back to sleep in the Pryor sod house at night, using the body heat generated by the livestock they'd moved into Pryor's space. Carl Swanson, the one who had laughed at the stone pit in October, spent 3 days doing exactly this, walking 800 yards to the dugout in the morning, sitting by the glowing pit through the afternoon, and walking back at dusk. He did not laugh. In the 3rd week of February, the blizzard activity slowed briefly, not warmth, but a reduction in wind and new snowfall that allowed a degree of movement. Farwell used the break to reinforce the fallen barn wall with the salvageable timber and canvas, creating enough covered space to shelter his surviving cattle through the rest of the winter. He brought back Britta and the 4 cattle he'd sheltered in the dugout, and came back himself the night of February 23rd, when the wind picked up again. When the true break came, In early May 1881, temperatures climbing above freezing and staying there, the snow beginning to melt in earnest, the accounting in the Mason Creek Valley was stark. 17 of the valley's 23 settled families had abandoned their claims during the winter or immediately upon the thaw, loading what they had left onto what wagons they could assemble and heading east toward the railroad at Broken Bow. They had lost cattle, horses, food stores, and in 4 cases, structures that had to be abandoned as unsound. 2 people in the valley died that winter. An elderly man named Werner Schwab, who had been sick since November and whose family had run out of fuel in January, and a young man named James Cully, who had been caught in the February 2nd blizzard trying to reach a neighbor's house. Frieda Halvorsen walked out of her dugout in May 1881 with both goats. The milk cow Britta returned intact to Hannah Sandvik, her frying pan, her mother's blanket, and $2.80 remaining of the money she'd arrived with. She had spent $2.83 over the winter, $1.20 on the door lumber, $0.63 on salt, flour, and matches at the Pryor store in November, and $1 on a second canvas for the window when the first one tore in a January storm. Douglas Farwell did not file a preemption claim on the ground at the base of the North Bluff that spring. He had lost 16 of his 23 cattle to the winter. He rebuilt his barn through the summer with a sod roof rather than a frame one. He did not speak publicly about the winter, or about Frieda's dugout, or about the $3 he had offered for her spade. He stayed in the valley and proved up his claim in 1885. Frieda filed a homestead entry application in the spring of 1882 with Hannah Sandvik and Ned Pryor as witnesses to her 2 years of continuous occupancy, attesting that she had resided on and improved the land since October 1880. The land agent at Broken Bow recorded her age as 21, the required minimum. She was 16. He did not ask for documentation. She received her homestead patent in September 1886. The 160-acre patent, now held by the Custer County Historical Society, includes her signature in a careful, practiced hand, Frieda M. Halvorsen. The hard winter of 1880-81 emptied portions of Nebraska and Dakota Territory more thoroughly than the drought years of the 1890s. Settlers, who had staked everything on a quarter section of plains ground, found that surviving the summer, the grasshoppers, the drought, the isolation was only the first test. The winters were the second, and a great many people who had passed the first one failed the second. What Frieda Halvorsen built was not remarkable in retrospect. Versions of the same basic technology had been in use on the plains for centuries. The earth lodge of the Mandan and Hidatsa peoples was a sophisticated, multi-family structure dug partially into the earth and roofed with sod and earth, designed explicitly to use geothermal buffering and thermal mass. Mandan earth lodges maintained interior temperatures of 50 to 65 degrees Fahrenheit through Dakota winters that reached 40 degrees Fahrenheit on the surface, without any stove more sophisticated than a central fire pit. The Mandan had been building and refining this structure for approximately 400 years before European settlers arrived and built frame houses next to them in the northern plains and then died of cold. The physics that saved Frieda's life in the winter of 1880-81 were not discovered in 1880. They were ignored in 1880. The settlers who filed homesteads on the Great Plains in the 1870s and 1880s brought with them the assumption that a proper house was made of lumber, the same assumption that worked in Ohio and Pennsylvania and upstate New York, where timber was cheap and available, and winters were cold, but not continental cold. On the treeless plains, that assumption killed people. Thermal mass stores heat the way a battery stores electricity. A thin-walled structure with a good stove can get warm quickly but loses its warmth equally quickly when the fire dies. A thick-walled earth structure gets warm slowly but holds its warmth for hours and days after the heat source goes out. The difference is not comfort, it's the margin between survival and not surviving. The earth below the frost line maintains a constant temperature approximately equal to the mean annual air temperature of a location. In Nebraska, that's 54 degrees Fahrenheit. In Kansas, 58 degrees Fahrenheit. In North Dakota, 44 degrees Fahrenheit. This is free heat, not dramatic heat, not heat that warms a room from cold, but heat that prevents a room from going below 40 degrees Fahrenheit no matter what happens above the surface. A well-designed earth shelter doesn't require generating warmth so much as it requires not losing the warmth that's already there. Animal heat is substantial and continuous. A milk cow generates more BTUs per hour than many of the small stoves available to plains homesteaders in 1880. Keeping livestock in the same space as people, a practice that European farmers had understood for centuries and called a longhouse, was considered primitive and disgusting by American settlers of the 1870s. It was also, by the engineering of heat transfer, entirely correct. The combination that Frieda assembled a below-grade floor, 3 earth-sheltered walls, a 2.5-foot front sod wall, a stone heat store below the floor, and 2 goats plus a cow created a system whose parts reinforced each other. Each element alone was insufficient, but together they produced an interior environment that the worst winter in Nebraska's recorded history could not break. The passive house movement of the 1970s, developed largely in Europe in response to the 1973 oil crisis, rediscovered the same principles through engineering calculation rather than survival necessity. Earth-sheltered construction became a recognized architectural category. The thermal mass of sod and packed earth walls was formally analyzed and quantified. Geothermal buffering, the technical term for what Frieda felt when she drove her spade to 3 feet and found warmth in an October that was already freezing at the surface, is now a standard element of energy-efficient building design. The woman who understood it in the fall of 1880 was 15 years old, had $5.63, and had just buried her last living relative in a creek bed in Nebraska. She had paid attention to the ground, and that was the difference. Frieda Halvorsen sold the northeast 40 acres of her claim to the Broken Bow and Northwestern Railroad, right-of-way, in 1887 for $140, $3.50 an acre, more than the land had been worth when Farwell dismissed her in October 1880. She used the money to buy lumber for a 2-room frame house, which she built above the original dugout site with Ned Pryor and his eldest son as construction help. She lived in the frame house for the rest of her life, but maintained the dugout intact behind it, accessible through a short corridor she cut in the back wall of the house. Her children, who came later, called it the root cellar. It wasn't a root cellar. It was the thing that had kept their mother alive in the winter that emptied the valley. The original dugout, or its remains, may still be in the clay and sandstone bluff at the east end of the Mason Creek drainage in Custer County. The ranch that now covers that ground was assembled from several failed homestead claims in the 1890s. The bluff is still there, the clay layer is still there. The springs at the base of the slope still run, dark and cold, into the same creek bottom where Frieda cut her sod bricks. If you drive a spade into the ground at the base of that bluff today, in January, and push it down to 3 feet, the ground at the bottom of the hole will be warm, 50 degrees, give or take. The same temperature it was in the winter of 1880, the same temperature it will be next January and the January after that. The earth doesn't know what a hard winter is. It just keeps holding what it's held for 1,000 years, patient and indifferent and warm.